You guys survived the hurricane okay over there?
Yeah.
I'm very,
No flooding in your house?
She's like way, she's completely died.
it's very legitimate that
But she lives up in Baldwin Park. Do you know where that is? She lives at this place, English place at Baldwin Park. So she drives.
Was the entrance to golf?
Yeah, she does too. Which is like right near the end.
This time? Yeah, okay.
It's like down, it's further down, it's right there.
Great.
It's crazy because it's like a community in its own little community. Yeah. She's paying so much.
Oh, did you?
$1,400. That's one bedroom, one bathroom apartment. Just because it's safe.
Oh, that must have been exciting. So how long was that trip?
Salary is going down. He lives in,
Did you visit the farm or just the area?
I don't know, I've been there. He lives closer to Oviedo.
they're bringing in like 1,000 outside.
You used to live in Ocoee? You ever heard of Ocoee? We went to that high school.
I understand.
Well, put it on this. It's already lined up.
Oh yeah.
How we do it?
Okay there, guys.
Did you get your mic?
Yep. Sure.
I have a morbid curiosity.
Yeah, I like interested, but not that much.
Yeah. I also appreciate. I'm like, I've had too many head injuries, so I go to as I get hit in the head.
Tell me
Yeah.
Tell me the seats are from my front.
Welcome. I'm Gail Sasnett, the Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center, and we're so glad to see you all here tonight. At the end of the program, there will be a time for audience Q&A, as we usually do, and we will ask that you come to the microphone because we are streaming and recording this, and you won't be picked up unless you do come to the microphone. I'll remind you to turn off your cell phones. And then here to introduce the speaker, we have Dr. Sean Adams, who is the department chair for history from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences.
Thank you. Thanks. It's my privilege to introduce my colleague, Jack Davis of the Department of History. And I could do a normal academic introduction where I kind of list all the various credentials that Jack holds, and he has quite a few. But I'd like to go in a bit of a different direction here because what I want to lay out for you is why we're all in for a really special treat. As I've learned as a professor in the field and also as department chair, history is a very book-driven field. And what I mean by that is that we are a rare breed, even among humanities, in that we demand books for professional advancement. And so what this means is that some colleagues basically string together a few articles, put in an introduction and say, here's a book, now promote me. And this is not the Jack Davis that his colleagues know and respect. His books are coherent, beautifully written works. They reflect a passion for the subject and a deep commitment to change whether that be civil rights or the environment. And these are not, I want to emphasize, not monographs that are designed to sit in the bowels of the university library. And instead, they offer a rare articulation between scholarly insight and popular inspiration. And they are written with an exquisite attention to the craft. I'm sure if there are any students of Dr. Davis's here, they can attest that he's a bit prickly when it comes to grammar, as we all know. But thankfully, the critics have joined me in recognizing Jack's real commitment to writing quality books. As his first book, Race Against Time, Culture and Separation of Natchez since 1930, won the Charles Sydnor Prize for the best book in Southern history. Jack then turned his attention to his native state with a second book with equal results, as An Everglades Providence, Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and the American Environmental Century received the gold medal in the nonfiction category for the Florida Book Awards. And his most recent book that we're going to hear about tonight, The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea, has already been shortlisted for the Kirkus Prize for nonfiction and has been named a finalist for an award from the American Library Association. And in fact, Philip Connors wrote in the New York Times that, quote, Davis has written a beautiful homage to a neglected sea, a lyrical paean to its remaining estuaries and marshes, and a marvelous mashup of human and environmental history. Now, his new book project, which I suspect we will be hearing about soon, is entitled Founding Bird, How the Bald Eagle Saved the Soul of America. And I'm going to take privilege as the introducer here to say I'm excited to see how he handles this topic, especially since Benjamin Franklin referred to the bald eagle as a bad moral character who does not give his living honestly, and as a rank coward. Now, before Jack corrects me, I know, as you all should know, that Benjamin Franklin did not say that turkey should be the national bird instead of the bald eagle. He was just saying that the turkey was a more respectable bird than the bald eagle. But in all seriousness, I wouldn't entrust this challenge to any other historian or author or writer, as Jack blends all of these best elements of the job description to anyone else. And Philip Connors concluded his review of Jack's book in the New York Times. How the Gulf Was Made Safe from Petrochemicals is a book I look forward to reading. Now, as a historian of American energy, I hate to be pessimistic and say I don't know if we're going to be around to see that day, but if we are, and I hope we are, it will be from no small effort from Jack Davis and his many contributions to the environmental history of Florida. So it's my pleasure to introduce you now, Jack Davis.
Thank you, Sean, for that. Am I on? You can hear me? I'm not getting any nods.
No, we need it up.
Need it up? Oh, no, sounds like it's not right. Okay, Sean, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and also thank all of you. I thank all of you for coming out this evening. It's such the weather's so beautiful. Why, for a change, why are we inside? I don't know, but we'll try to keep this on schedule, and so you can get outside and enjoy this cool weather. But so we're not on. Well, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm turned off.
It's at the top.
Yeah, there's no light. There we go. All right. Is that better? Am I coming through the speakers now? Yep. Okay. So should I just use my classroom voice?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're working on it over there. There we go. Okay. Okay. Where was I? Okay, we were inside. That's right. And so, in any case, I don't know where I was going with. Oh, and of course, I have to thank the Graham Center, Gail and David, and the staff at the Graham Center for inviting me to come speak and for hosting this event. I turn that off. Yeah, I just turned that off. So, there's an old golf maxim. If you birdie the first hole, you'll do lousy the rest of the course. So we've obviously started out with a bogey, maybe a double bogey. So with luck, we'll finish on a high note. So anyway, there was the Gulf of Mexico. That was my only image anyway, but it has some relevance to the talk, and perhaps we'll get it up again. So here's what I can do. I can stand over here and talk about some things. Actually, I had a number of requests to begin this talk, and actually I've had these requests before with other talks, to begin this talk by reading, by reading the opening to the book that sets the stage for the book, but also sets the stage for the talk tonight, and will give you a sense of my direction as a historian that I was taking in writing this book as a historian and also as a writer. In 1904, Winslow Homer spent the month of January fishing midway up Florida's west coast, where the Homosassa River quietly slips into the Gulf of Mexico. The painter laureate of the Atlantic had never been on the Gulf, and it delighted him with its natural palette of sea and shore, its color, movement, and history. Behind reedy coastal marshes rose a dense woodland, a jungle of green as Homer portrayed it, where splaying air plants and ferns hung in mottled sunlight, and the scent of aromatic cypress and red bay trees vied with traces of rotting organic muck. Homer likely listened for the double knock of ivory-billed woodpeckers sounding from interior corners, and studied the stealth pose of herons and egrets quietly fishing in the water. Its sweeping calm surface was the perfect vision of contentment, though a deceptive veneer over the restless energy below. Wherever Homer drifted with bait and tackle, the water beneath his rowing skiff was clear several feet to a grassy bottom, flush with crabs, mullets, and his 1,000 living things unseen. Among the most scintillating of sights were fish in schools as long as freight trains, running with the invisible Gulf tide. Their imposing numbers invited eagles and ospreys that circled overhead, and the wading birds tending to the shallows. They invited Homer, too, on return trips for years after. He was 68 years old, trim as ever, mustached as always, and at the height of his fame as a painter, acclaimed for his Atlantic seascapes. He was also an immensely passionate angler, as practiced at reeling in a fish as rendering one on canvas or paper. Come winter, he'd shutter his studio in Prouts Neck, Maine, and steal away to southern latitudes for a season of restorative recreation, usually on breezy sea islands. Surprisingly, he had not seen the Gulf of Mexico beyond its fringe waters of Cuba and the Florida Keys. For years, sporting journals had been extolling the sea in America's backyard as an angler's paradise, a last unspoiled frontier where wildlife still outnumbered people. Among all the outstanding fishing holes around the long, arcing coast from South Florida to South Texas, Homosassa was a perennial favorite. Forest and Stream called it, quote unquote, truly an enchanting spot where the, quote, knight of the rod can land fish of large size as rapidly as he can bait and secure his hook, unquote. Conquest came with such ease that Homer wrote home to his brother declaring the fishing to be the, quote, best in America as far as I can find, end quote. What also caught the attention of sporting journals was the distinct imprint of a historical place, one wholly excluded from the central narrative of the American experience. You could travel the coast all day without seeing another person, yet everywhere encounter signs of a vibrant human past in the countless aboriginal mounds that rose out of the flat wildlands. Compositions of earth and shells, typically overgrown with vegetation, they seemed as much a part of the natural burnish as fish and trees. They were built environment remnants of people who had occupied Gulf shores for thousands of years, though long since departed. There were tall ceremonial mounds and more modest burial mounds, some predating the birth of Christ by 250 or more years. Most were refuse heaps, called kitchen middens, that contained the shell and bone evidence of indigenous seafood diets and abundance, connective threads to the modern angler's bounty, and to a history still unfolding. Together, Gulf nature and the patina of the past aroused Homer's artistic sensibility. He was prepared for such moments. Wherever he traveled with rod and reel, he carried paints and brushes. As he matured as an artist, the native scenery migrated on his canvas and paper from backdrop to focal point. In many of his Atlantic seascapes, human subjects appear in detail, front and center, and often in contest with spirited, sometimes raging seas that speak to nature's paramount authority. Retaining this forthrightness in a composition of the Gulf where the water was often as unruffled as a mill pond required adjusting the scale of complementary elements. Among several watercolors that Homer completed at Homosassa, human subjects recede into a dab of color against a slate of restful water and a wall of green, over which palm trees ascend toward buff clouds and into the center of each work. In one such painting, Shell Heap, sable palms shade an aboriginal mound, spilling discarded oyster shells down to the water's edge, where two anglers float in a skiff, suggesting a continuity between the ancient and the recent. Like all of Homer's Homosassa paintings, Shell Mound conveys an intimate and vital connection linking humankind, nature, and history. I call this triad Homer's truth, and it lies at the heart of this book. So, Homer didn't become familiar with the Gulf of Mexico. By the way, he returned, he had 5 more years to live, and he returned to fish in the Gulf of Mexico every winter after this first one, with the exception of one when he was ill. And got to know, and he never painted again on the Gulf of Mexico. He spent all of his time fishing during his stays on the Gulf. And so he didn't get to know the Gulf of Mexico until late in life. How many of you here in this room, I want to test your Gulf of Mexico IQ. How many of you in this room grew up on the Gulf? Okay, a few of you. Where are you from?
Sanibel Island, Florida.
Sanibel, one of my favorite places. Occupies a prominent place in my book. Somebody else here. Where are you from?
Tampa, St. Petersburg area.
That's where I'm from, Pinellas County. And yes?
Fairhope, Alabama.
Oh, Fairhope, okay. There is a fantastic bookstore there, do you know it? Page and Palette? Yeah, I spoke there last spring. They fortified me, and they have a bar. And they fortified me with shots of bourbon while I was giving my talk. I think it was one of my best ever. It was certainly my favorite. Let me ask you this. How many countries border the Gulf of Mexico? No counting. David, how many counties? 3 counties, I'm sorry. Countries. 3. We have a winner in the front row here. And yes, 3. And can you name the countries? Yes. United States, Cuba, and Mexico. Right. Okay. Very good. So how many states border, not nation states, but states of nations border the Gulf of Mexico? 11. Mexico has 6 states that border the Gulf.
That was a trick question.
Yes, it was a trick question. 5 U.S. states. Very good. How did you know that? So Cheryl, what are those states?
Oh, come on.
I purposely picked out an image that didn't have political boundaries. Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, yes. And so my book actually focuses on the 5 U.S. states. And I chose to focus on the U.S. rather than include Mexico and Cuba into the central narrative for particular reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so within the taxonomy of world oceans, where does the Gulf of Mexico rank in size? You won't get it. David says 6, close. It's actually the 10th. Some people say the 9th largest or the 10th largest. There are actually 50 Gulf of Mexicos can fit into the Atlantic Ocean. and 100 Gulf of Mexicos can fit into the Pacific Ocean. The Gulf of Mexico is the largest Gulf in the world. It's the only Gulf, actually, in the world that's larger than Hudson Bay. Bays are supposed to be smaller than Gulfs, but there are really no hard and fast rules. And any geographers in this room? Okay, I can feel free to say what I want to about geography then. And speaking of that, geographers actually consider the Gulf of Mexico as a part of the Atlantic Ocean, which I think is a ripoff to the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf began forming long before the Atlantic Ocean was even a puddle of water, making the Gulf of Mexico technically the big sibling to a larger sea. And what's that? Oh, I thought somebody asked a question. And we're all familiar with the Gulf of Mexico's beaches. There's beautiful beaches in Florida. I don't know if you've ever been to the beaches in Louisiana. They're a bit lacking, and I'll explain why in a minute. The beaches in Texas are quite beautiful. Many beaches in Alabama are beautiful as well. And Mississippi's beaches, completely artificial, by the way. But in any case, where do those beaches come from? With the exception of Mississippi, which comes from a dredge. But does anybody know where the beaches come from? Stars. I like that answer, but no. Yeah.
Streams that come out of the Mississippi River.
Well, that's where Louisiana gets its beaches, sediment coming down from the Midwest, and it's dark, and it's hard, and it's pretty ugly. Which is one, and it's also transitory. It's constantly changing. But where do Florida beaches come from?
Would it be the Gulf Stream? Africa.
No, not Africa. The hurricanes come from Africa. And they come from the Appalachian Mountains. The Florida beaches do, at least. Over the eons, quartz has washed down from the Appalachian Mountains and given us our beautiful sugar sand white beaches, as many people describe the beaches. When I was a kid living in Fort Walton Beach, the Chamber of Commerce used to say, which has, I think, the most beautiful beaches in Florida, the Chamber of Commerce used to say that the resorts in Hawaii imported the beach sand from Fort Walton to put on their lava rock beaches. It probably wasn't any more true to that than there is to Billy Bowlegs, who was a local pirate. But the Texas beaches come from as far away as the Rocky Mountains and washing down the various rivers and streams and overland. The Apalachicola River was a major avenue of transportation for sediment, for sand or quartz coming to Florida. The Texas-Colorado River and the Rio Grande are the major beach builders in Texas. The Rio Grande, when it runs into the Gulf of Mexico, when it does these days, it has some 90 dams along that river. And when it hits the Gulf current, it flows north and builds the beaches. Now, you would think that, where do you think our tourist industry on the Gulf of Mexico began? You'd think with the beaches, right? But no. Does anybody have any idea what attracted the first tourists to Florida? Or not, Florida, but also the Gulf of Mexico?
Was it our springs?
Well, the Florida coast, I should say. You're right, the Florida Springs, but people stuck to the interior in the late 19th century. But in the 20th century, what brought tourists to the coast? Steve? Tarpon. That's right. People wanted to come down and catch tarpon. In 1885, a New York architect by the name of William Halsey Wood hooked the first tarpon in recorded history. And the sport fishing industry community just lit up. It caught fire. His catch was publicized in national newspapers and magazines. They learned about it in Great Britain. They celebrated this great moment because they knew the tarpon was this great fighting fish. They'd never figured out how to hook it. And so this 1885 catch brought men and women, mainly from the Northeast and from the Midwest and from the British Isles, to Florida and Texas in particular, to catch tarpon. And the response you have all of this building along the coast, these hotels, these resorts, many of them named Tarpon. So Tarpon is really responsible for Fort Myers. Many people think that it was the Second Seminole War. It was a dying place after that war, and the Tarpon revived it. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, virtually everything in Fort Myers was named Tarpon. And when the First World War broke out, on the front page of the Fort Myers News Press was not an announcement of the U.S. entry into the Great War, as it was called then, but it was the number of tarpon that had been caught, and what weight they were, of course. And in fact, let me read this other excerpt from the book about tarpon in the 19th century, or the tarpon industry in the 19th century. So I already mentioned William Halsey Wood, the guy who bought the first tarpon. There was also Edward von Hoff, who was from New York, who was a premier a sport fishing rod reel maker, and he designed a special reel for catching tarpon. And he mainly because he conducted something like 10 months of research and development in the Fort Myers region, and which pleased the people back in the factory in New York. So apparently it wasn't easy to get along with. Now probably know that Edison and what the hell is Edison's first name? Thomas. Thank you. God, I'm completely blank. Thomas and Mina, his wife, had a house in Fort Myers, and they were tarpon fanatics, and they loved to fish for tarpon. And there was a major tarpon resort down in that area called Giuseppe Inn. So I'll mention these in this passage. If von Hoff seems to be he set the record for the largest tarpon in the late 19th century. And if von Hoff seems to be overreacting, this is following a paragraph describing that catch, he might be forgiven. Tarpon fishing was an antidote for the perceived emasculation of his generation, linked to the disappearing American frontier, urban expansion, and a nation at peace. Sons of the bourgeoisie were gripped tightest by the crisis of manhood. Managing a trust fund didn't require physical exertion, and while one could demonstrate his masculinity in the dog-eat-dog world of high finance and business, he could still be weak in body. A flabby physique, once a mark of status that distinguished the manager, owner, and heir from the sinewy-bodied worker, a fishing guide perhaps, was falling out of fashion. A country led by effete men with shoulders that slope like a champagne bottle, as Theodore Roosevelt put it, allegedly jeopardized national security. So I go on to talk about masculinity and Theodore Roosevelt. Let me jump ahead and talk about men and women here. So big game fishing, says Paul Henderson, who has written fluently on Ernest Hemingway's Salt Life, wasn't a competition so much as a passion undertaken for its own sake. It was man against fish first, and against man second, and then woman. Confining Victorian womanhood was on the wane, and in no place more so than on the water. Women rejected any notions of tarpon hunting as exclusively male, though happily seated, lubricated, frat boyish houseboat weekends with bourbon and cigars to the other sex. That was part of the tourist trade, was renting these houseboats out to these men who would come down and spend the weekend tarpon fishing and getting drunk and smoking cigars, of course. Mina Edison's love affair with tarpon fishing was as intense as Thomas's. She encouraged her infatuation in her children and generated a stream of letters back north with fishing reports, knocking tarpon that rebuffed her bait as the, quote, sauciest things, end quote. Women hunted tarpon in the company of their husbands and on their own, decorated the clubroom walls with proof of their passion, and posed with some mighty fish. One of the practices back then was to take one of the round scales off a tarpon, write your name on it, and then pin it on the resort room wall. In fact, there are tarpon scales in a place called Tarpon Inn in Texas that have, excuse me, I'm forgetting everybody's name now. Who was Theodore's cousin? Franklin Roosevelt. Thank you, jeez. Christine B.M. Hawley had her picture taken at Usepa Inn on May 6, 1914. A widowed 31-year-old New York socialite with a fancy for bridge playing. She was a strikingly small woman. In her trophy shot, she squints into the sun from behind prim eyeglasses and wears a billowy ankle-length walking skirt, topped by a mock Navy-style white jumper with bib, collar, and neckerchief. The mouth of the hanging tarpon is gaping, as broad and round as a basketball hoop. The fish looks big enough to swallow her. Holly was the first woman to receive a silver button awarded by the Inn's Anglers Club to guests who landed a tarpon weighing 150 or more pounds. Hers tipped the scales at 154.5. Recognition of an arcane sort survived a century later. The Inn's restaurant served an 8-ounce Angus beef burger, grilled to your liking, named the CBM Holly. Holly had used a Baumhoff reel. When the reel designer caught the tarpon that made him dance, he broke a record held for 7 years by another widow, Mrs. George T. Stagg. The historical record leaves a virtually barren trail to her life, not even a sign of her own name. Such was the state of American womanhood when women lacked a vote and when married, personal rights, and a separate identity. The trail leads to her husband, a Kentucky whiskey distiller, on his second marriage, and to little more than a single platitude within the documents. Quote, Mrs. Stagg possessed the charming modesty of her sex, end quote. She caught her 205-pounder on the Caloosahatchee River from the family yacht, and beyond charming modesty, exhibited the fish at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So, the tarpon, quite a heritage on the Gulf of Mexico. How many of you guys are familiar with the dead zone? The dead zone off at the mouth of the Mississippi River that forms every summer. But what you probably don't know is the direct connection between the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, one of the largest in the world, probably the most famous in the world. They can expand to the size of the state of Delaware, and even in some summers, the size of New Jersey. The most famous dead zone in the world has a direct connection to baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. Did you get that? The dead zone of Gulf of Mexico has a direct connection to baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. Does anybody have any idea what that connection is? Well, to know, you'll have to read the book. So now, you probably know a little bit about hurricanes, and a little more than you'd probably like to know. But the Gulf of Mexico is a hurricane alley. It averages more than 2 hurricanes a year, which is significant. It's not the busiest hurricane alley in the world. Actually, the North Pacific is. But it is significantly busy, and it's mainly because the warm waters in the Gulf act like a magnet and draw hurricanes in from the Atlantic Ocean, from the Caribbean and the Atlantic. There are occasional hurricanes that come to life within the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Atlantic Ocean. And the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. Does anybody know what hurricane that was? Not Camille, the deadliest. The Galveston, yes, killing some 8,000 to 10,000 people in 1900. The Galveston hurricane in 1900. The costliest hurricane is also a Gulf of Mexico hurricane, and it looks like Harvey will exceed Katrina as the cost is. And right now they're estimating $190 to $200 billion in damages. Katrina caused $108 billion in damages. Now, speaking of storms, this is related. Take a look at the shoreline. What geographic feature is missing from this shoreline, this image of the Gulf? What shoreline feature? I should say, is missing
Barrier Island.
barrier islands. That's exactly right. If you look at a map that shows barrier islands, you see that they line up all the way around the Gulf, principally around the 5 U.S. states, and almost end to end. And they are important. They're buffers against storms such as hurricanes. They're also responsible for creating the Gulf of Mexico's wonderful estuarine environment, which I think I mentioned earlier. There are some 200 estuaries along the 5 U.S. Gulf states. And you all know what an estuary does, right? It's incubated for marine life, vibrant living places that give life. And where you have an estuary, you have to have fresh water. The majority of the fresh water flow, 85% of the fresh water flowing into the Gulf of Mexico comes from U.S. rivers. And you have those barrier islands that traps the seawater or the salt water with the fresh water, which makes an estuary. There are other things that go along with that, but that's essential. You've got to have that mix of salt and fresh water. And so, consequently, the Gulf of Mexico is one of the richest or healthiest, or not healthiest, wealthiest estuarine environments in the world, concentrated around the 5 U.S. states. That's one reason why I focus on the U.S. states in this book, because of the ecological characteristic in the Gulf of Mexico. And as a result of those estuary environments, the Gulf of Mexico has been a premier commercial fishery in the United States. After the Second World War, the Gulf fishery began exceeding the entire East Coast fishery. 80% of the domestic shrimp, and the majority of the shrimp that we get here is not domestic, by the way. About 80% is not domestic. It comes from Asia. But 80% of the domestic shrimp sold and are marketed in the United States comes from the Gulf of Mexico. And 40% of the domestic oysters come from the Gulf of Mexico. And many chefs from coast to coast say that the most delicious oysters are those that come from Apalachicola Bay. And so barrier islands are extremely important. We often don't notice them these days. Why? Because what's on them? Most of them. Condominiums. And you drive along a shore road just a few feet away from the Gulf of Mexico, and you never see it. For miles, you won't see the Gulf of Mexico because those damn condominiums are in your way. And you have no idea that you're on an island. It looks like an urban area, right? How many of you when you go to New York City, think of yourself being on an island? You don't. You're on an island. It's the same with our barrier islands here. But some of our islands are distinguished. We have the largest barrier island in the world. Does anybody have an idea where that is? Where that's from? The Gulf of Mexico has the largest barrier island in the world. Just think about it. What state might have the biggest?
Padre Island?
Yeah, Padre Island, Texas, yes. Padre Island. Hunt, did you say that? Yeah, very good. Have you been there?
No.
Okay. It's a beautiful place, Padre Island. It's a national seashore, much of the island. And let me tell you, if you go there and it doesn't move you emotionally, check your pulse, because your heart's probably not beating. Padre Island's 113 miles. There was a major condiment invented on a Gulf island. What was that condiment? You got to know this. Tabasco sauce on Avery Island in Louisiana. And I read all about the invention of Tabasco sauce, because the man who actually built, the son of the inventor who actually built Tabasco, made it what it is today, the company what it is today, was a major bird conservationist in the 19th and early 20th century. And now, the most densely populated barrier island on the Gulf of Mexico is in Florida. Does anybody have, who's from Pinellas County? It's down in Pinellas County. What island do you think? Treasure Island. Nearly 5,000 people per square mile. Sanibel, by contrast, has approximately 450 people per square mile. They also have the largest bank accounts in Florida. And so, one other thing. How many of you guys fish offshore? How many of you guys go deep sea fishing? Okay. You really do? Okay. And have you ever gone 20, 30 miles out? 25. And how deep is the water? If that, usually around 15, 20 feet. 20, 30 miles out into the Gulf. It's very shallow. And why is that? Well, you can see it on there. That is the continental shelf that you see, the image of it underwater surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. And around Florida, it reaches some 90 miles in places off the current day shoreline. And actually 10,000 years ago, people lived out there. And that was the original beach. And you imagine living in Gainesville back then and driving out to that beach? It'd take you a couple of days. It'd take you longer than that because you'd have to wait for Henry Ford to come along. So that's what this book is about. It's about the 10,000-year relationship between the Gulf of Mexico and people, both Gulfsiders and the people who were connected to the Gulf of Mexico from faraway places, such as those fishing enthusiasts from New York and the Midwest and from the British Isles. And one fact I forgot to mention, well, I didn't forget to mention, that I haven't mentioned, and which is a result of that relationship, is that the worst oil spill in U.S. history occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, that was the BP oil spill of 2010. There may be, how many of you are familiar with the oil spill that's occurring at this very moment? I don't know why it's not making the headlines. This oil spill called the Delta House oil spill. I don't know if that's named after a sorority, but the Delta House oil spill, another BP affiliated enterprise, approximately the same location. It's a leaking pipeline 30 miles off the coast of Louisiana. May turn out to exceed the BP oil spill of 2010. And now, by the way, oil spills are not including the BP oil spill. Oil spills are not the worst environmental disasters the Gulf has suffered. Not even close. And we can talk about that during the Q&A, if you like, about what is the worst environmental disaster or disasters the Gulf suffers. So I began the research on this book before the, I don't have a clock in front of me, and my thing's not working. How are we doing? 6:40. Oh, okay, so I need to wrap up here, please. So I began writing this book, research on this book, before the Gulf oil spill. And I didn't quite know how to put the history of the Gulf of Mexico together. It seemed a little bit too daunting to me. And I couldn't find the story that I thought should be told. And then this floating platform, none of us had ever heard of, exploded 40 miles off the coast of Louisiana in April 2010. And 11 people tragically died in the accident. And the rest of us, many of us were probably reading in bed at the time, perhaps even thinking about the next day being Earth Day, the day the Deepwater Horizon sank into the Gulf of Mexico. And then for 87 nightmarish days that summer, we encountered nothing but headline news about the Gulf of Mexico. And the oil spill, ultimately, as I saw it, robbed the Gulf of Mexico of its true identity. So this really gave me my motivation, my central theme for this book was to restore the true identity of the Gulf of Mexico, to describe tell readers what this sea really is. That it's more than an oil sump. It's more than a sunny beach. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, and so writing this book, I had this intimate relationship with it, and writing this book was truly a labor of love for me. And as Sean said, this book wasn't written for an academic audience. It was written for a general readership, those people the intellectually curious reader. And for them, I wanted in writing this history of the Gulf of Mexico, I wanted to ensure for that readership that the Gulf occupied center stage, that it not simply be a backdrop, that nature be the driving force in this history. I wanted to show how nature is a historical agent in the human experience. And so I organized the chapters in this book. To do that, I organized the chapters in this book around natural characteristics of the Gulf of Mexico. Estuaries, fish, birds, amazing story about bird life on the Gulf of Mexico, and the early period of bird conservation, which in America more or less originated in the Gulf of Mexico. Birds, all sorts of sea life, hurricanes, which are natural phenomenon, of course. Beaches, I have a chapter on beaches. Oil, which of course is a natural element in the environment, and weather generally. So all of those and more, all those natural characteristics, rivers as well, because they are so important to the Gulf of Mexico environment, but also the human history of the Gulf of Mexico. And so it was all of these natural characteristics that shaped the course of, as I argue in the book, the course of Gulf of Mexico history. And so the point I wanted to make with this book, that I wanted to leave readers with, that is, this book is about connections. A lot of historians focus on conflict. That's what they wanted. They frame their history around conflict, or answering the question of, is a conflict or continuity that's driving history. I like to focus on connection, and that may be connections, but that may be because I'm an environmental historian, and I see the world itself, including humans, as this one large ecosystem. And I see history, in some ways, as this one large ecosystem. The story that's full of these connections. And in this book, I'm trying to make a connection between the past and the future, and hope that this book is a useful history for the readers. And with it, I want to encourage Americans, not just Gulfsiders, not just Floridians, not just Texans, but all Americans, to connect with the Gulf in a mutually wholesome way by reminding them that we have this marvelous sea in our backyard that is more than, as I said before, more than the soil sump, it's more than the sunny beach. It's a sea that has shaped our history, it has enriched our lives, and is freely given to us. Indeed, we've taken a lot from the Gulf of Mexico, and that's okay, but to continue to take from the Gulf of Mexico, we have to give something back. And it's not a lot. The Gulf of Mexico doesn't ask a lot from us. What it does ask from us to keep on giving, to keep on being this giving, living sea, is our respect for what makes the Gulf this wonderful place. And that's its estuaries, to respect its estuaries, to respect its rivers, to respect its natural coastline, and its diversity of life, including us. We are part of that diversity. Thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Who wants to come forward and ask the first question? And we do have his book for sale over here in the corner, so we're all over. Go buy a book, and Jack will sign.
My question is a subject that I don't think you directly touched on yet, and that's the pollution problem from pesticides, fertilizers, plastics. I don't know if this has anything to do with the Saturday cartoons, but I was thinking maybe cornflakes or something like that, and all of the after effects of increasing consumption of products like that.
Who are you? How are you so smart? and why are you ruining my book sales?
I'm made from stardust like everyone else.
Okay, you're right. That's exactly right. I do write about this extensively in the book, about the pollution that comes. The pollution that comes in the Gulf originates primarily from other places. Not the daily impact is from faraway places, such as the Midwest. All of this stuff coming down, various industrial chemicals, but primarily agricultural runoff coming out of the Midwest is responsible for the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. And where does this agricultural pollution come from? It comes from growing corn primarily. You were in Wisconsin. It's, you know, during the spring and summer, it's like snow in Maine. I mean, it's everywhere. You can't escape it. Corn grows everywhere up there. It used to be like orange grows here, growing up to the side of buildings. And so the agricultural, the fertilizer runoff runs into the various rivers and streams that feed into the Mississippi River, and all that comes down to the Gulf of Mexico and creates this gigantic algae bloom, this dead zone, where no sea life can live for the summer. And that's our connection to Saturday morning cartoons, because what? Cereals. And what's in cereals? Corn, yes, but what particularly today after 1970 or so? High fructose corn syrup. And all of that comes from is produced in the Mississippi River drainage zone that eventually makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. And so reflect back on your childhood and those wonderful cartoons, and you bugging your parents about going out and buying you Cocoa Puffs or Trix or something. And scientists have actually traced the origins, the birth of the dead zone in its growth to the growth of cereal, or the cereal aisle in grocery stores. When I was a kid, the cereal aisle wasn't big. Now, it's like cable TV. You can't figure out which cereal to select. There's so many options. But the Gulf of Mexico dead zone was born in the 1950s with the baby boomers and their cereal. Not to mention hamburgers and hamburger buns and all the feed that goes into feeding the cattle that makes the hamburgers and the growing of the potatoes and all that. Next question. Yeah.
That image confuses me a bit. I assume the lighter area is a shallow water.
Yes.
Okay. And I can understand that in an earlier life I fished out of Crystal River every weekend. But if we wanted to catch snapper, we had to go to the middle ground. I mean, halfway to Mexico.
Right.
And yet now I can go to Sandestin or Destin and be in deep water 2 miles offshore.
You may be in a hole there, 2 miles offshore.
Well, 2 or 3 miles. I mean, I can
however many miles. Yes, in the
and
snapper
it looked like it's that the deep water is that close to the land up in the Panhandle.
Well, there are pockets of deep water, and you have found them. And in the late 19th century, that's where the snapper fishermen used to go.
Right.
Are you going there to catch snapper?
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's where the snapper fishermen went. Coming from Pensacola was the major fishing port, with accents from around the world, particularly New England. Pensacolans don't remember this. They're very proud of their Spanish and the Confederate heritage. But you mentioned to them New England heritage, and that you're likely to get run out of town. But you could go to Pensacola in the 1880s, and you would hear virtually nothing but New England accents around the fishing piers. And because the snapper was right where you go fishing for snapper, and it was red snapper capital of the world in the late 19th century, and they fished that area out in the 1880s, and they had to go elsewhere looking for the snapper.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, first off, let me just say I'm really glad I rented myself out of the house tonight, because anything streaming into my house on a cable on any screen was not as going to be as good as this. So
thank you
for that. I'm an executive director of an environmental nonprofit here in Florida, and also teach at Santa Fe College. I teacher of science. And it occurs to me that we're experiencing a continuing decline in a general awareness of the outdoors and environmental issues in this country, certainly in Florida. I'm wondering if you have any tips you can think of to try to restore that awareness.
I have a 12-year-old daughter who has told me, Dad, I don't like the environment. And so I'm totally frustrated too. I don't know how to get the kids out of the house. I mean, we have, in our day, it was a TV that was the one indoor distraction. But we also had baby boomer parents that said, get the hell out. I don't want to see you until I ring the cowbell. And we listen to them, and you can't, parents don't do that today. It's a battle. I don't know. It's a real battle with the young kids to get them outside and get them off the screen. And they're so clever about arguing to stay on the screen. Well, I got homework. I gotta have to do this. I have to look this up for school. I can't do a word master without my phone, Dad. It's a real struggle. I mean, you have to. If anybody has any suggestions, I am certainly open to them. I wish I had some. And if you can get your family to do outings together and drag the kids out, once you get them outside, they'll go kicking and screaming. Once you get them outside, they are completely different people. And they're the child you want them to be, believe it or not. So it's the initial extraction from the house and the screen that's the hard part. But once you get out there, you're in pretty good shape. Do you have a suggestion?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll take notes.
When I was young, there were things like the Boy Scouts and summer camps. What I think would be the most helpful thing, rather than intellectual arguments, would be for various institutions, whether it's a Florida Springs Institute or it's the high schools and the churches and so on, to sponsor things like canoeing and hiking and being out in the environment and doing things, but it needs to be, I think, sponsored by various institutions.
Yes.
And I think if we would do more of that, it would be more effective than just writing articles and so forth.
If we could, I agree with you, if we could get the public schools off the standardized tests, there might be time allowed for the kids outside. My daughter goes to Jordan Glen, which is a private school, and the kids do everything they can outdoors there, including eating their lunch every day. And thankfully, we have that, and that gives her outdoor time. And she goes to summer camp too, and that gives her outdoor time. But again, it's a real challenge. I think that the parents have to be firm. I think the parents, first and foremost, have to understand the value of outdoors in the upbringing, the intellectual and the emotional development of their children. And Richard Liu writes about this beautifully in his book, The Last Child in the Woods, and talks about various scientific studies that have demonstrated the importance of interacting with nature. Any other questions, Mitch, or, Jean?
Yeah. Thank you. To change the subject, do you have an update on the Georgia Apalachicola suit that's going on right now? I was told that Florida has inadequate language to protect their water, and therefore they cannot force Georgia into doing anything because they themselves, Florida itself, is not doing anything.
Well, Florida's been trying to do something for decades now, since the 1980s. It just hasn't done the right thing. You just stated the update, and what was he called? The special, not prosecutor, decision maker, I've forgotten, appointed by the court, decided exactly that. But Florida hasn't shown adequately that it will protect its water, or that Georgia and the Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for the depletion of water quality, primarily around Apalachicola Bay. It's been a tri-state lawsuit or contest. It's been in various forms in the courts. It's been in arbitration between Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Atlanta, big-bellied Atlanta sends all of its effluent down, not all of it, but a good portion of its effluent down the Chattahoochee River, runs into the Apalachicola River, that is destroying the Apalachicola Bay, and will probably put the oyster industry out of business there. I predict within a decade. But again, Florida and Alabama have been fighting Georgia because Alabama has a dog in this fight too, because of the runoff that reaches its waters. and they've been fighting this since the late 1980s, and they have not been able to come to a settlement yet. So my guess is that the industry will die and Atlanta will continue to flourish. Mitch.
Just a straight ahead history question. Why do Americans call it the Gulf of Mexico?
Well, at one time it was the Spanish Sea for probably longer than it's been the Gulf of Mexico. But map makers finally settled on that name, the Gulf of Mexico, and we inherited that. Rather than Gulf of America, for instance. And I can't say why. I mean, Americans just inherited from the map makers, from the European map makers, and stuck with it. Which is not to say that Americans didn't want to possess the Gulf of Mexico. Jefferson had his eyes on the Gulf of Mexico even before the Louisiana Purchase, and Cuba as well. And he believed that the only way that America would be whole is to take Spanish Florida, take the Louisiana Territory, and Cuba. And Andrew Jackson offered to President Madison to get Cuba for him. So just give me the go-ahead, give me the manpower, and I'll get Cuba for you. But Jefferson also had his eyes on Cuba too. But I haven't never run across any evidence that somebody's saying, let's change the name to Gulf of America. And Gulf of Mexico just seems to roll off the tongue better, I think.
Is there one final question?
Yes.
And this will be our last question.
So the BP oil spill inspired you to write this book? Because
No, I said just the opposite. I was writing it before the oil spill.
Right, but you wanted to restore its identity.
Yes,
correct?
okay, yeah.
So it's been 7 years. To what degree has its identity been restored, if at all? And then secondly, what, if not the oil spill, is the greatest natural disaster to take place there?
Okay, good questions. Well, just today I Googled Gulf of Mexico, and the first thing that came up was oil spills. So unfortunately, the Gulf of Mexico is still associated with oil, primarily, I think, or to an extent that it should not be. The book has got national attention in national newspapers. I've gotten emails from people on the West Coast, many from the Northeast. So the book is getting out there, and whether or not it will restore its identity is anybody's guess. But again, for my preference, it's still too closely associated with oil and the oil industry, and Delta House certainly will not help. As far as the worst environmental disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, or environmental disaster that exceeds the BP oil spill, every day is an environmental disaster that exceeds the oil spill. From what comes down all these rivers, including Florida's Fenn-Holloway River, just west of us, it's created its own miniature dead zone, coming from one damn cellulose plant that was opened in the 1950s by Procter & Gamble, after the state of Florida more or less gave Procter & Gamble the Fenn-Holloway River, designated it an industrial river, meaning pollute at will, and that cellulose plant has been polluting at will ever since. And rivers around, they're much cleaner than what they were in the 1970s. In the 1980s, the bays are in much better shape too, because the river's been cleaned up, but there's still a lot coming down from those rivers. It's the oil industry infrastructure that creates most of the pollution, not the oil spills. And that's on a daily basis. Galveston Bay, where all these oil tankers run, where all these oil refineries are, leading into the Houston Ship Channel, Galveston Bay suffers over 280, close to 300 toxic spills a year, industrial spills of some sort. The most toxic polluters in the country since the 1980s have been located in Gulf of Mexico states. So that's what's worse than the BP oil spill. And that's what there are numerous. I don't want to leave you, Gail, please. I don't want to leave I got to leave them on a high note. I want to talk about Cedar Key. But there are people all across the Gulf of Mexico, these activists, who are my heroes, that are working, like Joy Zell over in Taylor County, who's been fighting that damn cellulose plant for decades. Linda Young up in Pensacola, Diane Wilson in Texas, and many, many other activists that have been trying to clean up the bays and the rivers. Every bay and river has multiple conservation or environmental groups protecting it and working to clean them up and restore their health. And they've done a tremendous job since the 1980s. So we're in better shape than what we were, but we're not in the best of shape. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for the fabulous talk. Thank you, audience. Books are here, and Jack will sign.